Thank you very much for that warm welcome, Lisa, and thank you to the Henry Moore Institute, Christy, and everyone here for hosting this event, and also for the collaboration with the University of Leeds, through which I am also grateful, to which I am also grateful. Griselda Pollock is here with us, who concocted this Leverhulme professorship, visiting professorship, as an opportunity to spend some time thinking also through the documenta and what it was. And it has been a great privilege, so thank you for being here. Precision is not the word for this evening. It's rather a compost of things in all directions, kind of universal, everything you always wanted to know about sculpture, but we're afraid to ask in 40 minutes. So I really doubt that there'll be anything close to precision. But it is true that in working with artists like Susan on exhibitions, we go way back, I think, to the Internazionale in Castello di Rivoli in the early 2000s or further. 2000, yeah. Yeah, or Art Pace, yeah, many years ago. Actually, we go back to 1999 when Susan was invited as a visiting artist to PS1 Contemporary Art Center, where I was at the time curator. And so it is always a great pleasure to be with you, and
likewise.
Okay. And so here we go. But the precision is an attempt to present works or to work with artists in ways that the work will be glorious and meaningful, and so it's like housekeeping. So anyway, I really appreciate very much that term, curiosity, because I often think about the documenta as an inverted curiosity cabinet, going from the brain, which somehow recalls the association of objects and materials, sculptural and non, in a curiosity cabinet, as opposed to the subsequent Enlightenment and so on canonical collections of museums. However, as an inverted curiosity cabinet, where the form is centrifugal rather than centripetal into it, as it connected outwards onto many events. For example, some elements of that brain referred to the deportation and the moment of the Nazi period in Kassel, which of course then expanded outwards towards the Bahnhof, the Hauptbahnhof, where Susan's work, Study for Strings, was located, and which I hope to end my part of this evening and then turn over to you. So I look at sculpture bearing in mind a ton of things, including some ideas put forth by Heidegger on what is a thing, but also in his famous discussion of the jug, but also some ideas put forth by Merleau-Ponty slightly later, especially right after the Second World War, with a dismembered body. So how do we reconnect with that body? Concerning embodied knowledge. I look at it also through the ideas of endosymbiotic coevolution, as opposed to linear evolution of species, of the biologist Lynn Margulis. And I look at sculpture also bearing in mind some notions of coactancy of Bruno Latour, which actually are very old ideas of sculpture. If one reads very old texts about sculpture, one reads, of course, about the way that the material tells you what to do, and you follow the material and so on. And this is very close to ideas of coactancy, as opposed to this authoritative subject carving exactly what they want to carve in the sculpture. As well as keeping in mind some thoughts of Jane Bennett on new materialisms, Elizabeth Wilson's, but also Isabel Stenger's ideas on cosmopolitics, a revolutionary politics that is based on an alliance with both the cosmopolitan and the cosmic, let's say, forces interacting, as well as I speak about sculpture bearing in mind some thoughts of quantum physicist and feminist science studies philosopher Karen Barad, and her ideas of entanglement, or applying ideas of entanglement to the mysterious, spooky action at a distance. As Einstein said, entanglement was the way things and materials, once they are entangled, they act and they dance together in a correlated manner that is not explainable, such as photon entanglement and so on. And the way that she always reminds us that the void is not a void, it is very full of matter and subatomic particles interacting, and the way that she suggests that there is no subject and object until the two come into the world at the same moment in a co-emergence. Behind all of this lies for me the enthusiasm, what I would call enthusiasm, but she would call SF, speculative fabulation, an inspiring leaps of the imagination of Donna Haraway, as well as you rightly said, my own background and ground in Arte Povera many years ago. That's Cunelli's untitled 1969, the sculpture, the equestrian sculpture of the late 20th century, in a former garage turned into a art gallery, which often happens to such types of buildings in the late 60s. And he, of course, pulls the space back to its having been a garage, but not for a lot of horsepower of automobiles, but for what was used before, the actual horses that are parked. And it becomes a theater of the world where the live and vital materials, entities of the world, can become art insofar as the exhibition space becomes a stage, and therefore if the exhibition space is a stage, then the elements of the language on that stage can be as live as you want on any theatrical stage, because they will always be parts of a language, of a grammar, which is the big shift that Arte Povera brings into the landscape of not only sculpture, I would say art in the late 60s, along with other co-emerging forms of what in the north and west of the world was called post-minimalism, but in other parts was not, but parallel to Arte Povera happening in other places, like in Brazil with Lydia Clark and with Oiticica, and in other parts of the world as well, Monoha in Japan and so on. So this evening, I haven't actually started. I would like to speak about different ways of thinking about sculpture, a bit as a game. So let's take it as a game, going in many directions and going nowhere special and nowhere in particular. I'd like to talk about visible sculpture, but also invisible sculpture, or apparently invisible sculpture. And I'd like to talk about sculpture as storytelling and sculpture as narrative. Before we do that, I would remind us, and that is the Heidegger question, that all is related to an aesthetic of nearness. And I think sculpture, one way of thinking about sculpture is how to consciously create a condition of nearness, while form making and thing making. A painting might be a picture on the world and might therefore be actually not an aesthetics of nearness, but an aesthetics of distance somehow. So there's something particularly intimate that has to do with intimacy and nearness, that is the possibility almost of a usage of the material which is near. Through form making and thing making, at times with others. I remind us all of the social sculptures. This is Beuys at Documenta in the Office for Direct Democracy, 1972, Documenta. Very important to me is that he had his rose on the table during the moments of conversations, and so that the formation, the importance of the social sculpture for me is not only as being an expansion, let's say a movement towards an expanded field, sculpture in the expanded field in the Rosalind Krauss notion. It's not only that shift away from the idea of the sculpture as some sort of an object that we walk around and that we look at and that we interact with. Not so much of that, but in the consistent notion that that sculpture made of the relations in the conversation and therefore the changing of the perspective, so that the molding or the carving is actually the molding and the carving of a new politics, of a new sociality, of a new being public. But it is always the presence of the ecological in Beuys singularizes him out of simply a story of sociality as sculpture or politics as sculpture, and reminds us that all the human interactions that go on in the social sculpture can only exist in a contingency or a correlation with the sculpture that the human is not making and that the human is only a part of, which is this sculpture of the world in our collaborations with the so-called nature. And the rose, of course, is an indication of that in this image, but it is, of course, also contains a secret and contains the mystery which the rose has always represented in many theological visions, whether it's Christian or Islamic and so on. Therefore having to do, and also having to do with love, and love as a form of building of sociality and community at the initial bond of that. So this is very complex sculpture. We could talk 40 minutes about that, but we won't. So form making and thing making at times with others, and this is an example of at times with others. This is an image of the making of the sculpture in Kabul at the Queen's Palace in the Bagababur Gardens for the Documenta 13, which was the work of Adrian Villarojas, the counterpart to the work that was done in Kassel that you may have seen. And we'll go back to this at time with others, at time alone. And I'd like to come to this particular sculpture. That is the space of the sculpture. And that this space of sculpture is the space of touching. Whether one sees, whether one actually touches something, or whether one is touched by something, or whether one touches through some transitive property, or whether that is also a touching that is invisible to the naked eye. Indeed, sometimes I think of mirror touch synesthesia, which has only been recently coined, very few years ago, but the syndrome exists and has existed forever, is perhaps necessary to be a sculptor or to be any viewer of sculpture. I think of mirror touch synesthesia as the space of the experience of sculpture. Mirror touch, to remind you, is a syndrome where you feel tactility, you feel tactily when you're only seeing something. For example, you're not actually being slapped or beaten, but you see someone being slapped or beaten and you feel it on your body. So some synesthetes are very perceptive to this and must close onto almost autism in order to live their daily lives, and certainly can't go see certain movies like Kill Bill. Kill Bill. Yes, can't go see Kill Bill. So a sculpture is indeed in the space of the imaginal, where we see it as an image. We walk around it or through it. We rarely touch it, and yet its physicality and its embodied nature suggest the sense of touch, and its objecthood seems a given. Even though theoretically it could be that our hand goes right through it, it could be just really well technically made. It is poised, therefore, somewhere in between the image and the thing itself, in a space that has been forgotten, but that Aristotle knew well, that the images had a materiality to them. That if there is an image in a mirror, even if no subject is there to look at the mirror, the image is there. So therefore, there is this space between the image and the thing itself, which is the imaginal space, is somehow this imaginal space of a particular mirror touch syndrome is the space that I see as the space of sculpture. Baroque art, in particular, was attuned to creating synesthetic experiences in its viewers as a mode of conjoining the transcendent and the immanent in emerging modernity. The Baroque sculptor and architect Bernini attempted to represent a state of bliss or ecstatic polysensoriality through synesthesis in his renowned marble sculpture, The Ecstasy of Santa Teresa, which I often speak about in lectures, 1645 to 52, and that you see in this slide. Located in the Cornaro Chapel of the Santa Maria della Vittoria Church in Rome. And by the way, Baroque is very important to understand arte povera, just to touch something else. The Ecstasy of Santa Teresa features Teresa of Avila, one of the saints of the Counter-Reformation, who described the ecstasy of religious awakening as a flaming golden arrow that had pierced her heart, balanced on a cloud and flanked by an angel. Through this work, Bernini expressed a form of mirror touch, a condition of infinite pain, combined with utter pleasure and sweetness, and his ambiguous imagery between the erotic and the mystical is both tragic and lyrical, in my view. The dying saint leans backward on a floating cloud made of stone, with eyes closed and mouth slightly open, while the angel, who has just removed the arrow from her body, observes her intently, holding onto her robe gently, so that the touch is somehow referred to also pictorially and figuratively in the piece itself as a kind of secret indication to the viewer of the whole experience of the sculpture as intended by the artist. The saint is engrossed in her experience and cut off from the world around, suspended in an instant where the physical, sensorial, and the emotional are completely one. This is the intention of Bernini, and where mortal passion is sublimated into the love of God. Her body seems to have disappeared, however. Her flowing robes appear empty, with myriad folds that blend into and become one with the clouds upon which she is resting. It always reminds me of Deleuze's Le Pli, which of course is a reference to Baroque and to the folds, and to a topological space that can be infinitely unfolded and yet really small, like the genie in the bottle story, sort of. The angel, by contrast, is portrayed as a physical and worldly being, almost a displaced self-portrait of the artist himself, observing ecstasy from the outside and conjuring up the statue tactilely from the rock. We won't go into a feminist reading or critique of this today. The key to this, The key to this sculpture lies in its vertiginous sensation of experienced synesthesia, which it portrays and also suggests the spectator might also experience in watching it, and in the precarious balance representing a shift from the notion of this transcendent ecstasy typical of Middle Ages and early Renaissance to an ecstasy of immanence and the body typical of the nascent modernity in the 1600s. Often accused of being overtly erotic, the saint is boldly present and palpably attuned to her body. At the same time, she is experiencing disembodiment and a visionary experience, suggested both by the metallic golden rays of sunlight falling behind her from above the altar and the actual light, if you go to visit the chapel, but you see it on the stone here in the photograph, suffused light filtering in from the church window hidden just above the sculpture in the same chapel. So there are these two rays, the ray of the sun, which isn't there if it's raining or night, and the rays that are the gilded rays. This duality marks the shift from a fundamentally medieval universe of absolutes to the modern world of individualities and specific subjectivities that was emerging at the time. A world where religion and science could still coexist within the theatrical suspension of disbelief, and still quite far from the Cartesian cut and division of the mind-body and arts sciences that was soon to come. Crucial to this world is the ability to embody knowledge in the experience of the senses, the aesthesis. And the viewer is carried towards an experience of mirror touch tactility through the image of the arrow and the expression of the figure after having been pierced. Sculpture intervenes in the shape of things in space, in their form, in our form as well, in relation to their form, or in our form as it takes shape through the relation with other forms. This is the traditional pre-Beuys, let's say, pre-Rosenkrauss way of thinking, but I would like to argue a little bit in favor of it, a lot in favor of it. It is usually and most simply defined as artistic practice that activates our 3D perception and is generally embodied, as we have seen. It has been distinguished according to techniques, for example, the removal of material, chiseling, or as in the Bernini we just saw, of marble, or the modeling of material like clay, as we see in this image of Marisa Merz, that I brought in also because of the question of nearness. Here it's two elements of the sculpture itself that are speaking about this nearness. So again, a key in the figurative elements of the sculpture is a key for the viewers to how to understand the experience of the sculpture itself, as was the touching in the preceding image. The question of nearness and visionarity in Marisa Merz is fundamental. So in this classical way of saying, you know, we spoke about the removal of material chiseling or the modeling of material like clay, or the copying of things through casting, whether by traditional indexical techniques such as molding, or through the current techniques of post-internet, so-called post-internet sculpture, such as 3D scanning and then using a plotter. And I'm not interested right now in, I think that's just as indexical because you need a scanner to scan the legs of the chair in order to then upload your picture, in order to then do whatever you do with it and ping pong it back with other artists and then plop it out with your plotter. Or the combining of objects and or materials, another possibility, like assemblages or collage, a kind of combination of different ways of what we just said. Now, this traditional view of sculpture goes back, in a Western traditional classification of sculpture, goes back indeed to Western authors, in particular to, I remind us, to Plinio the Elder. His 1st century AD, he died around 79. Encyclopedic Naturalis Historia is still the basis for such classifications. However, it is such a pleasure to go back to Plinio the Elder, although one knows that the idea of the Encyclopedia Historia Naturalis has to do with the imperial moment of Rome. We are speaking of the 1st century AD, so bringing back to the center the glories of the far distant elements of the empire and organizing and classifying them, quite similar to the world fairs of the 19th century colonial periods. But nonetheless, the pleasure of reading Historia Naturalis is that sculpture is described as a subsection within a section about minerals and how they might be used, which are books 33 to 37. And the two always categories, whenever he speaks of how minerals can be used, or even in the other books about botanics, is always in medicine and in the arts. So in the healing of the body, like for example eating some iron, and then in the arts how they can be used to make these crafted objects. Because at the time, of course, in the West, sculpture was not part of the high arts, but part of the craft techniques. You got your hands dirty a little bit, too dirty. Too manual, and that will continue, although greatly respected in the books about the minerals as a subcategory of our knowledge of minerals, was the use of minerals. the use value of minerals, which brings us all the way to today, to so many people reading Alfred Gell and to read art as enchanted technology. What is the use value? What can it provoke? What stories can it cause to occur? What can that meteorite, had it gone to Chaco, from Chaco to Caso, what consequences can it have? But going back to the beginning, this goes on until the Renaissance, more or less. Leon Battista Alberti, in his book De Statua, which goes back to Plinio very much, distinguishes again the two major modes. He distinguishes two, la via per levare and la via per porre. So to make sculpture by adding material, like so modeling and combining would be one category, because it's not yet distinguished as in modernity between modeling clay and making an assemblage of found materials. Is still one, la via del porre, and he distinguished it, however, from the via del levare, which is to take away, to chisel away. So, and that's 1462, but still it's in this moment that it begins to be closer to the high arts than it was previously. I'm going to skip everything in between and go all the way to Rosalind Krauss, because there's no other way, you know, we have to make some choices in life. So let's say that more or less everything after that is more or less the same story, but articulated differently, a little bit better or a little bit differently. And until Rosalind Krauss comes along in October 79, no, in 79 in October, and she writes her text, Sculpture in the Expanded Field, where she posits post-minimalism and minimalist sculptural interventions, including land art, as postmodernist practices, quite different from that previous, so more traditional way of conceiving sculpture, which is what we just described. Now, although greatly revolutionary and greatly in allowing us to conceive theoretically, because it had already been done by the artist, she was reflecting on what the artist had done, sculpture in an expanded field. So through some sort of a structuralist or semiotic way of looking at the sculpture no longer as something that is put there, but that is together with the there, in land art, or I'm looking at Susan because that has a lot to do with her work. So at the same time as she's opening up our theoretical speech around sculpture, she also is oddly performing the same mistake that she criticizes in all her predecessors. So the same problem that she denounces is her own problem. In other words, she says that everything before is in a sort of linear modernist evolution of critique of the preceding way of thinking. Well, we have to radically go out of that linear historical story of this leads to that in sculpture. And yet, if we look at it from today, and if we look at it especially looking at everything that didn't happen or that isn't happening in the north and in the west of the world, or even in the north and in the west of the world, we can see how much this sculpture in the expanded field notion is also a closure in a way. Especially, it is a closure to the possibility of the autonomous object. And why in the world would we not be able to make an autonomous object that has nothing to do with the context where it is, and that can be moved from one context to another and change completely its significance from one place to another? Aside from the fact that she didn't discuss arte povera nor installation art, which is the tricky one, because installation art is exactly that bridge from sculpture in the expanded field to the possibility of the both heteronomy and autonomy of the objects and materials in the spaces where one is walking through, of pistolettos minus objects. This is Penone's tree, bronze tree, which was cast from many different kinds of branches from many different trees to make a kind of tree. He's from Torino. Italo Calvino's from Torino. We all know about the fascination with the tree. You know, in Italo Calvino, it has to be a real tree. So it is a kind of tree, an ideal tree made of many trees, branches together, and combined with this sculpture made not by the human sculptor, but by the river, which is the river stone. So this is a kind of philosophical rebus, or a philosophical question around the relationship between the human-made and the non-human-made, and how they interact in this one piece. Aside from the questions of illusion and then nearness, because when you're near, you see it's not a tree and it's bronze, but when you're even 20 meters away, you might think it's because of the way the patina is. And then the relationship with Boyce, and Boyce's 7,000 oaks in the presence of the small tree that grows next to it, and the inversion of the relationship between the stone and the tree from the Boyce 7,000 stones, which are somewhere here, we don't know. These are just earlier images from the late 60s of his work, Penone's work, which I won't comment. I think they are self-explanatory in how they relate to that piece that we just looked at. But I wanted to speak at this point. I was going on to the question of my interest in, let's say, things or objects, and the current speculative realism, which is so rampant and dominant around many intellectual circles, and with which I feel an affinity, but also a great doubt over. Mainly because I think that it is a movement of thought that, to speak simply, is a swinging back from constructivism to realism, and doesn't really go beyond the phallocentric and patriarchal dichotomy between constructivism, the world is there only because I construct it, and realism, the world is there independently of whether I perceive it. So that was a whole, like, 2 pages about that. But I think the synopsis I gave, so I think they're both true. You know, they're both true. And the important thing is to not collapse into this Kantian human exceptionalist subject, but the world is there only insofar as I'm making it. Is true also for the bees, also for the lava, also for the volcanoes. So if it is like Chus Martinez, my colleague, speaks of an organism with not one brain, but an octopus where the brain is in every part of the body, which is her essay that just came out in the last issue of Efflux journal, then there is no problem with this idea of interactive co-emergent subjectivities. So there's no need to throw away Derrida and Deleuze in order to realize that matter matters. I think I'm just going to leave this aside and just look at the pictures with you at this point. And we will see something that is sometimes visible and sometimes not visible, and just open up some questions. So one of my favorite sculptures in the history of the world, in my situated Italianness, because I'm part Italian, is Piero Manzoni's Socle du Monde, which was done in Herning Park in '61, I think, in Denmark. And it is an inverted socle base where upside down is written Socle du Monde, which means base of the world. So by creating this sculpture, he actually is making a base for the entire globe. And if we change our perspective and imagine that we are on this planet on top of this socle that is the base of the world, because every point is the center. If one thinks in terms of physics, there is no center. There is no sun that is the center. There is no subject that is the center. There is no planet that is the center. So if everything can be the center, then everything can be the base. And if this is the universe held by this Socle du Monde, then we are all now part of this sculpture. So here we go. We're in the Henry Moore sculpture center homage to Henry Moore, and we are part, as all of Henry Moore's works, of Piero Manzoni's megalomaniac sculpture, which is part of a tradition of nominalism. So we could say that it is a sort of extreme case of the ready-made, that I nominate something as art and it is art. But at the same time, that extreme, this is Piero Manzoni himself, in his other moment of extreme hubris, which is the making of the can of shit. So from the most minute production, material production, involuntary material production of the sculptor, his shit, to the I sign the world, he is like a kind of Duchampian delirium. We celebrate also through him the opposite of the megalomaniac delirium, which is the incredible Pereckian, Georges Pereckian celebration of the daily, and that the world is already there, that everything is already there, that we need not add anything to the world, but we need only to look at the world differently, or focus, or cut out a piece of space of that world, which is also an arte povera idea, particularly that of Alighiero Boetti. So another bunch of cubes, I just thought we'd go on this rambling of cubes here, was some years later, Pino Pascali made his cube of Earth, which was a response and polemic with American minimalism. He wanted to remind us that specific objects, they don't just come into the world, that pieces of steel or square objects that are industrially produced are also produced through the sweat and tears of people that are deep in mines that sometimes explode, like in Turkey last week, and that the earth is a gift of millions of worms that make it. And so a cube is a cube, is a cube, is a cube, is not exactly so simple. And related to this, I thought I would bring this image of Oiticikas giving the earth back to the earth. So again, an artist like Pascali living on the lower edges or the margins of the wealthy parts of the world. In Brazil is a restitution of earth, you know, that you can buy in plastic bags to the earth. Interesting to think in relation to Smithson's sites, non-sites, because here you have a kind of overlapping and a return of the site to the non-site, or the negative and the positive are again somehow conjoined through this compassionate, as Bracha Ettinger would say, sculpture created with the materials themselves. I just thought I'd throw that in because we can't not put the spiral jetty in, and I thought it would inspire you. And we just looked at that Oiticica. And then I wanted to show you this picture, which is one of the most difficult and challenging sculptures that in the expanded field, that is not in the expanded field, is Doris Salcedo's piece called The Abyss, which we made at the Castello di Rivoli in a room where a person in the 1700s had been walled up. The windows had been bricked up, and in this room that normally hosts a Mario Merz igloo, she wanted to make the bricks descend along the four walls without, however, touching the floor, so that the light and the doors, and you could see underneath outwards, and one door was just a little bit higher, but for health and safety, but you still had to bend down to get in. So in this case, it is as if the whole architecture were to collapse upon you. And again, it has to do with why matter matters, that sculpture is not a conceptual endeavor. It has to do with embodied experience. Walls are not made from the sky down. They are made from the ground up. And it was very complex to be able to actually find ways of working together with architects and engineers to find a way that this could happen, because it's against the law of physics. You cannot actually build a wall going from up down. So you have to anchor it in certain ways, but if you anchor it, it becomes too heavy, for the old wall of the palazzo. So it ended up having, I didn't know how many holes and anchors, maybe 50,000. I mean, it was an incredible work of anchoring of these materials to the walls so that it could invert the prison, basically, invert the idea. And it was of the prison. It was connected with, in particular, a very harsh emotional experience of these centers of detention in Torino for illegal immigrants coming from the other side of the Mediterranean. Italy is the first country that is reached. The EEC seems to think that it's only an Italian problem and we have to deal with it, but it's washing their hands of the problem. And the Italian government is not taking care of although there's a pope who says we have to open the floodgates, we still are in a situation of detention centers in Italy of extreme harshness in the center of the city. So it was these walls of the detention centers that turned into the reversed walls of the Doris Salcedo piece that went from the sky down. So they are somehow liberated walls. Then I wanted to show you Fajvović and Goldberg, because, and this is maybe the last thing that I'll say before talking about invisible sculpture, and which is not immaterial at all and concerns Susan. I mentioned to you that I wanted to talk about storytelling. And indeed, I think that one of the most interesting characteristics that I see going on in different parts of artist practice today is a sort of inversion of the idea of sculpture in an expanded field. It's almost that the expansion is the expansion into narrative. So how can there be an agencement between the embodied in the material and the narrative and the storytelling? What stories, what histories, what personal stories, what material culture is attached to certain objects, to certain trajectories? So the kind of magic that Alfred Gell speaks about when he analyzes the ends of the boats that are carved is about craft, but it is very much about the stories related and connected, and the political actions related and connected to those materials and objects. So what I see going on in this advanced digital age are many things. I mean, there's a ton of stuff. But one of the ways in which what goes on when we look into our computer and we're looking and reading little stories and snippets of stories through a link off of Wikipedia and so on, and then what goes on in the world outside of this when we're organizing our intense aggregation of people that is the exhibition, the occasion for intense aggregation of people, the re-emergence of this public space as exhibition. What we are doing is we're dragging these objects, or the sculptors, the artists, Susan also, are dragging these stories and narratives with those materials. So the sculpture, even though it appears contained in that particular space, doesn't exist without all that other material that it is baggage. So in this particular case, the story of the Taco meteorite, of the meteorite field in the north of Paraguay, the north of Argentina, right near the border with Paraguay, that Fajvović and Goldberg have been intensely studying and publishing stories and books about, not stories, books about, documentary books about, it's an excavation, literal excavation of the story of the obsession with meteorites, the story of the obsession of moving certain materials from the south of the world to the north of the world. The story of a particular one, the taco that was cut in Germany. There's the line just before it's cut, half sent to Buenos Aires Museum, half sent to the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian is polished and clean. The Buenos Aires one is rusty on the outside and inside, while it should only be rusty where the cut, I mean, it doesn't make, neither of the two makes sense, the polished or the rusty. And the bringing of the two halves together provisionally, and then the restitution of them as a kind of healing, let's say temporary proposition of healing of this cut object, is also the carrying of all that story that then continued. This was a pre-documenta event with the Porticus, which was followed then with wanting to bring the largest of the fragments, so the Chaco, to the Fridericianum as a temporary provisional omphalos, which was not agreed by the indigenous peoples of the Chaco region, the Mocoit. And we had many discussions. You know, there were meetings and town meetings and contrasts, and it's all on the internet, the whole story of this. And then artists like Etel Adnan of the Documenta saying, oh my God, but we must convince them because it's going back, and it's not it's about the potential of imagination, this promise of felicity that art promises. So let's get the Chaco to Castle for this. And then it didn't. But what was done was another cube. So I show you this other cube, which was of the same weight as the Chaco piece. And I didn't want it to go because I respected fully the choices, even though it was a minority, but it's still, you know, one voice. My democracy is one voice is enough for nada. So one Mocoit not wanting to move it is enough from my perspective. So this whole story is part of the extended, not expanded field, the narrative field of the sculpture, and it is part of the sculpture. It's not background material to the sculpture. Similarly, oh, and this is just a picture when the violence of pulling out this Chaco anyway from the land, which is against the traditional Mocoit way of thinking, because it should be under the land, and then you have this magnetism above you. There's these bugs around because of the intense iron. But I'm just going to skip all of this and go straight to Susan. This is all Adrian Villarojas I wanted to talk about. Adrian has much to do with the actual making and fabrication is almost a decoy. It's almost an occasion for the worlding together that occurs with the people that are making it, that occurred in the seminars in Kabul, that occurs on the brick farm with the bricklayers today. I'm just showing you in the background images of Adrian's piece, the piece you haven't seen, the one that's in Kabul. The brick farm, which goes on today with miniature-sized copies of the objects that were in Kassel, where the communities of the brick makers and the community of the artist studio are overlapped in another chapter of this story, of this one long extended sculpture of things that materialize and dematerialize, like Mario Merzi's igloo appear and disappear. Like his works are not cooked and so on, and they seem like huge and monumental, but they're actually very provisional in their existence. And his view of that is in this continuous metamorphosing of the, here you see the piece of Documenta big that is in a model now for being placed in the brick farm. So we're going to skip that. What I wanted to do was go to the invisible. And I was going to use Francis Alice's piece, the paradox piece, where he pulls a piece of ice through the city of Mexico City until it disappears as a kind of hinge towards speaking about immaterial sculpture. And I was going to go back to Mel Buckner's sculptures made for the purpose of those photographs, so that all that we actually have are these virtual sculptures through the photographs, and discuss them in relation to what you were speaking about last night, which we might go to, this, the way children play these games on the computer. Is that sculpture or not? The Lego, so we can go back. But I thought I'd bring in the Buckner as a kind of antecedent of that. But in addressing the immaterial and invisible, I was going to bring you The Wind of Ryan Gander and The Underground Party of Ryan Gander, also in the Documenta. The development of sound as sculpture, the first case I know of the shaping of space through sound, the spatial sculptural molding of space through the acoustic, which was Atsuko Tanaka's Bell from 1955, not Max Neuhaus. However, Max's piece is Max's work is very important in terms of that history of sound sculpture, so-called invisible sculpture, which is not invisible at all. And then I was going to speak a moment about Janet Cardiff and George Burris Miller's work, but I will go straight to Susan Hiller's piece. Susan Hiller's. Susan, oh gosh. Susan Hiller's.
We love Susan Hiller.
We love Susan Hiller. Yeah. To the castle piece. And that's the one that I'd like to end on, and just to connect back to what I was saying as the extended field of sculpture, which is the possibility that the sculptural practice is actually hinging together the storytelling with the material embodied work. Because this piece, when you went onto the platform of the Hauptbahnhof far enough away from the bustle of the front area, you heard sounds which sounded very almost metallic, almost of wheels of train cars, coming from different speakers in different areas of the platform. And what it was a torn apart, you will describe it better, but it's a torn apart piece of music composed by a composer while he was in the Nazi concentration camp Theresienstadt for the purpose of making a film for Hitler to prove to the rest of the world that the Nazis were treating the Jews very well in these prisons, to the degree that they had concerts and organized concerts. And the name of the composer is?
Pavel Haas.
Pavel Haas. Susan, in this dismembered body, which is, and you will speak about it for us, that visitors would listen to and slowly learn, as you see in this picture, someone is reading the guidebook. The story, I mean, the way that Susan speaks about this piece is not in the same way that, you might put as a footnote where a material of Carl Andre comes from, or where the object that dig the hole for Heiser came from. That's not relevant to the piece of Heiser, but it is part of the work. So the story attached is not a story attached, but it is actually a part, a co-part of the work itself. So the sounds and the experience of the sounds and the memory of this story are all one, and that is what I wanted to discuss with you and ask you about, if it might connect into your work. I mean, as being one way of looking at some of the sculptural practice that's very connected with storytelling, I would say, going on today. So, that's all I have to say.
Great, Carolyn. Very interesting. Okay, well, that was really great, Carolyn. And yeah, I'd like to pick up from where you left off and talk about study for strings in Documenta and Castle. But before I do, I just want to say that, well, it's great to be here. Thanks a lot for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be talking beside Carolyn. We've done it a few times now, haven't we? But yeah, so I just before I go on to talk about that, I wanted to say where I've just been, which is Scandinavia. I've been installing this epic installation on the entire west coast of Sweden, going from Bornholm right up to Norway, Moss in Norway. And it's 9 different locations, and anyway, it's the biggest thing I've ever done. It's 900 kilometers long. So, Rosalind Krause, eat your heart out. But yeah, so but it's there was quite a lot of technical problems along the way. I mean, it's a radio transmitted project, and it's like a bit like taming a savage beast working with analog radio. So it was. But so I was going to just show you what this little thing first, just because it's so recent in my.
Yeah, you just arrived.
I just arrived last night, straight from the beautiful west coast of Scandinavia. This is called the Distant Sound, and it starts from, as you can see, right down at the tip of where Bornholm is, and then finishes in Moss. So I was asked by this organisation, newly formed organisation, they've called themselves Insight, if I would consider making a work that would unite all 3 countries, and that would be on the coastline. So I, at that time, was really busy, and I thought it was quite a daunting prospect, so I wasn't so sure if I wanted to do it. But then they said, well, please come and have a look, and then decide. So I did. I went in the middle of winter, but even though it was winter time, I mean, the landscape is so, I mean, it is so beautiful. And then you're on the west coast, and you're looking out at these islands. There's all the places I visited seemed to have this one thing in common, that there were these little islets that had broken off from the mainland. And so again, I was thinking, like in Documenta, when we were at the end of the platform, thinking about sound coming from a distance, you know. And I could imagine that the sound could be projected from afar. But then it's impossible to do that because there's no power in these little islands. So then the next place that I was brought to was Varberg. And in Varberg, there's this, one of the partners of Insight is actually a real radio station, Grimeton radio station. And then I just thought, of course, that's how we can do it. If I really want to have sound projected from these far off places, we could do it via radio signals. So I sort of discussed it with them there and there, and they said they were very open to the idea, and so then it became a radio transmitted sound installation that was a 3-channel one. That was transmitted to these 9 different points along the coastline. And so when I first went, like I say, I was really inspired by the coastline, but it was only when I was in Moss, when one of the curators was showing me this map that was on the wall, that there was such a thing as the Moss Sound. Now, a sound, everybody knows what a sound is, but there's also a sound as a body of water between 2 land masses, and I thought, okay, so then that's why I called the project The Distant Sound, you know, that I was because I wanted to work with these. So everything sort of fell into place just on that site visit, that it would be a radio transmitted project, and that I would work with the radio station, Grimeton radio station. And those are the 9 different places, partners that you can see there. So what the radio station could do was they could give me 3, I needed 3 channels because it was a 3-channel sound installation. I wanted 3 frequencies, so they managed to get me 3 frequencies. This is actually a postcard, or it's what's known as a QLS card, and it used to be that every radio station had its own radio interval signal, and people used to write into the radio stations just to say I was able to get a reception from, you know, Australia or wherever, you know, their favourite radio station. And they were called QLS cards. So this is sort of, the format's kind of been modelled on that, and these are the 3 radio frequencies that the Grimeton sorted out for me. And so by having 3 radio frequencies, I can then work with 3 tones simultaneously. So what I've done is I worked with the people of Grimeton, the radio technicians, and who are absolute radio experts. And we built a prototype working with a solar panel, like a bit like in Sunset Song and Art Pace. And we had this huge antennae and the receiver. So we had made 27 of these little, they look like little space pods or something, and we put them on the coast, and we waited to get the reception from Grimeton.
Why 3?
Because I wanted to separate the tones, like so. Okay, I didn't start from the beginning. Radio interval signals are, like I say, I think I mentioned, every radio station used to have its own, and especially
like
Yeah, or like do 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 do. Then it'd be a pause. Then do 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 do. This is Radio Faroe Islands.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you know, so it wasn't just. It was like a placeholder.
Yes.
You know, so you weren't just. It wasn't just nothing you could tune into, and you recognise. Okay, that's the right radio station. I just have to wait for the program to come on. But some of the older radio interval signals are really beautiful. They're kind of very simple, usually made by these radio interval signal generators. And like some of the tunes were very kind of, like I say, simple, melancholic and distant, I felt. And so I chose 9 radio interval signals from the region, like Radio Sweden, Radio Scans Mercure, Radio Faroe Islands, and also I chose radio stations from far off places, like, or you know, like I say, pirate radio stations where the work was transmitted from a boat in the middle of the ocean, you know, because the themes of those themes of separation and distance, I wanted to evoke those themes in the work. And then each of the 3 tones, I got a horn, a trumpet player to play each of the radio interval signals, but each tone separately, in the way that I worked with the tones in Study for Strings and Documenta.
So Documenta was the first time you take a piece of music and take it apart in different speakers, different tone, like
yeah,
A will
tones
always
for
be
tone.
here.
Yeah, so separates the tones.
But there are more than 3 tones.
There are more than 3 tones, but not much more, because like I say, they're very simple. But so say like there's 5 tones, so that's, I use like those 3 speakers, like do 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 do. So they're all separated, you know, which means you can really work with this very large space. You know, I had one speaker on one island and another on another, so that when it's separated out like that, they begin to sound like other things, like ship's horns. And
so no one in one specific place will hear the whole.
Oh no, you absolutely hear the whole.
How, if it's on a different island?
Because it's, well, the islands are very close together. They're like little islets, you know, they're like little land masses that have just been broken off. You know, like...
So you are standing on one island and you hear this other tone from another island.
You can just about see it, you know, the little tiny fragments on
Yes,
yeah.
But my question is, if you're in a particular location where these speakers are,
yeah.
Can you as a visitor hear the whole radio interval signal in each of these places?
Yeah.
So the speakers are on different islands, but not so far.
Yeah, well, some of them are far, but sound can really travel across water, and you do,
yes.
you do hear, yeah. Okay. But it's from a distance, so it's not like really loud, you know. And,
is this sculpture? Since we're here.
Well, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's definitely sculptural, and I think in the sense that it, I mean, it does. I mean, from the beginning, I've always been. I mean, I studied sculpture. Sorry.
Yes,
remember we were talking about that last night. Carolyn was asking me how to make, if I knew how to do molds and things, and I haven't done that for 20 years since I was a student. But I did study, I did specialise in sculpture, and I did do all of those. I did learn to make molds and casts and arc weld and carve and everything. I did all that. Yeah. So but when I started working as a student, I started then working with sound, introduced sound into my work, and I've always liked to sing.
Yeah.
And then so then it was really when I went to Belfast that I started really thinking about making sound installations, because I started really becoming aware of what happens when you when you sing. You know, you have to really use your diaphragm, and what happens when you project the sound out into the room, and it's a very sort of the physicality of producing the sound. It's quite a sculptural experience, and you become really aware of your inner body space. And so I started thinking about introducing sound into my installations then, you know, sculptural installations. And you know, that's when I started thinking or working with how the architectural concerns of the sound and how it could define the space and also make you aware of the place that you're in while heightening your own sense of yourself. So those concerns have always been in the work from the start. You know, so you asked about, do I think of it as sculptural? I think it definitely can define the space and make you heighten your own sense of yourself while you're in the place. And it might be a place that you've been to many times before, but you sort of might see it in a new way, if you like. Yeah. So that was just there yesterday, and I just came from Moss yesterday, which is way up there. So I thought I would just mention that first. And the team are still there, and we're finally getting it to sound good, because at first it was all out of the synchronization was all out from Grimmington radio station, so I was having panic attacks up until very, very recently. So yeah, so that's the distant sound, and it opens on Saturday. So if you're in Varberg on Saturday, you're all very welcome. This is actually my new audio guide. I took my inspiration from Alex Ross. He did The Rest Is Noise, and he has this incredible audio guide that accompanies his book. And I thought I might do the same. And there's also not just images and clips but of my own documentation, but of others. Like I've used YouTube clips that people have uploaded, amateur videos, because I think some of them are really captured things that I didn't manage to capture in my documentation, you know, moments where I wasn't there, that, you know, so even though they're amateur on iPhones, I think they're really good. So anyway, yeah, this is Study for Strings. When Carolyn invited me to come and have a look, she invited me to Castle to think about a place. I couldn't really find a place initially until we went to the train station, and I sort of knew almost immediately, but I didn't know anything about it. I just knew that it had the right kind of. It was quiet, strangely, for a train station, and it was only when I walked out to the platform's end that I could imagine that sound would travel towards you from a distance, you know. And so I thought I could really envisage a sound installation there and occupy that space, that deep space, and you could see the hills and hear the birds. It was very peaceful. So, so Carolyn said, okay. And then, you know, then I did a bit of research into the train station, and even Kassel, you know. At Kassel, I mean, it was the most heavily bombed city in Germany because it built ammunitions. And if I was able to just follow the track around, looking out from the tip of the platform, if I could follow the track just round the corner, it would come to the Henschel and Sons factory where they built the Tiger I and Tiger II tanks, and it was slave labour. Where they built. I don't know if I've got the image here. No, I don't. But anyway, so and then I'd sort of, one thing that came to my mind when I was standing in the train station was Austerlitz. Sebald wrote Austerlitz, this really great novel, and it's about a man who's constantly going from station to station. He's trying to find, and it's about him trying to find his mother, who was an opera singer who was sent to Theresienstadt, and that's where they apparently sent the creative people. They would send to Theresienstadt, like the musicians and artists and poets and writers would be sent to Theresienstadt concentration camp. And that's where they sent Pavel Haas, and while he was there, he composed this Study for Strings. And like Carolyn mentioned, they wanted to make a film of Synesthesia as a good example, as a model or a camp to show to impress the Red Cross. So they not only filmed the concert or the orchestra play Study for Strings, but they filmed other things like children's choirs and everything. And they asked Kurt Geron, he was a famous actor who was in The Blue Angel with Marlene Dietrich, and you know he was also sent to the camp. You know, he directed the film, but and you can see the film's actually up on YouTube. You can see it, the film from the camp, Synesthesia, and you can see Pavel Haas takes a bow. You can see it on this website actually if you go on it at the end. But then straight after the film was shot, they were all sent to Auschwitz, and the majority of them were killed. But miraculously, the conductor, he survives. The score is destroyed, but he survives, and he remembers the score, and he manages to piece it back together again. And they also have the film footage, so it survives today. And so what I did for my work for Documenta was I recorded just 2 voices from the entire composition, the viola and the cello player, and I asked them to play each of the tones separately. And had the speakers right out on the train tracks in Kassel, so that the sound, each tone seemed to be fragmented and coming from a distance. And so because I've just used 2 instruments as opposed to the entire orchestra, it sounds very different from the original, but it does still evoke this feeling of or this, like you said, the sound of trains, doesn't it? It really did sound, it sounds like that. But I just might play a little bit, because I don't want it to be too loud. We tried it earlier.
But only 2 tones? Or 3?
No. There were 24.
But only 2 instruments, I mean.
2 instruments,
But
yeah.
when the other instruments are supposed to play in the score, they are not played by the 2 instruments. They are simply a gap. They are like missing.
Yeah,
so there's like pauses, and so it's as if you're removing. If we want to use classical way of speaking of sculpture, you're allevare. You're taking away material.
Yeah, well,
in a way, from the composition. You're sculpting it out, carving it out.
Well, I'm just not recording it. So
well, that's pretty much like not carving. I mean, you're carving out from the score. So there's a score which is not. It has holes in it.
Yeah, it has the gaps where the other instruments should be.
Yes, very interesting.
Yeah, so I wanted to evoke a sense of the absence, you know.
You wanted to play a little bit?
Yeah, I was going to play it. It might be a little loud, but because we tried it earlier. Before we open up to questions, I wanted just to finish with my most recent exhibition, which is Part File Score, an exhibition I had just finished a couple of weeks ago in Hamburger Bahnhof Museum in Berlin. And I see it as part of a trilogy, actually, starting with the Documenta piece, Study for Strings. I then went on to make another work called The Missing String, and that was, I see it as a part of a trilogy because I focus on 3 different composers from the same era. And the second being Richard Strauss, but I won't talk about that work right now. And the third being Part File Score. Now, Part File Score was a work that was inspired by a composer, a German composer called Hans Eisler. Now, Hans Eisler was one of the emigres, one of the people who had to flee Germany in the 30s to escape the Nazis, and along with his mentor Schoenberg, who you may have heard of, and they go to LA finally, and so Schoenberg and Hans Eisler all end up together, and so basically what I've done is I've recorded 3 film scores of Hans Eisler. Hans Eisler then went on to work in Hollywood. And again, I've treated them in the same way. I've recorded each of the tones, tone for tone, so that every tone comes from its own speaker. Now, Hamburger Bahnhof, I don't know if you've ever been in it, but it was a former train station. And so I wanted to remind people of that by stripping it back just to the bare bones, so you really see it as you're reminded of its former function as a train station. And it's got these incredible 12 archways, and you know, it's a very impressive, quite daunting space. But, so I was inspired by the architecture of the Hamburger Bahnhof, you know, these 12 archways. And I had done some research during my time, the research I did for Documenta. I had come across Hans Eisler and the emigres. And I became interested in 12-tone, he was a 12-tone composer, which is also known as serialism. And there's a strong sort of connection to
atonal music.
Yeah, it's atonal music, and it relates. It's related to structural progressions in the visual arts and architecture. So, so what I've done is I've laid out, I've recorded each of the tones, each of the 12 tones, and have them in the space. Each tone coming from its own speaker. And as there's sometimes 2 instruments, there are 24 tones. So I really sort of have it out in this kind of grid formation. So I'm really working with the framework of the serialism, you know, of the dodecaphonic technique, it's also known as. So like you were talking about nearness, I never heard that expression before, but by recording each of the tones like that, you know, you do hear it as a whole, but you also can hear each of the tones separately, so you can be very close to one speaker, and you sort of become more focused on the sound of the instrument rather than the music. It sort of takes the music out of the work. Anyway, but I did want to show one film to get a sense of it, because it's, you know, the one I showed you last night. Okay, so Part File Score, where as I mentioned, I worked with these 3 film scores that Eisler wrote, and the first one is, it was written for a film called Opus 3, and it's an incredible film if you ever get a chance to see it, and it's all about movement and rhythm. So I wanted to sort of create that sense of movement and rhythm in the physical making of the work, and also the themes of displacement and separation and movement. So so that's the first film score. The second is his most famous one, which is 14 Ways to Describe Rain, and that was a book. He wrote this book with Theodor Adorno, and it's music for films, and that was the case study, the 14 Ways to Describe Rain. And the third film score that I worked with in the work was a film score that he wrote for Charlie Chaplin, because Charlie Chaplin knew that Eisler was in trouble because he was under observation by the FBI, and they had compiled this huge file on him over 6 years, and they believed him to be a communist infiltrator, and that he would indoctrinate Hollywood with his communism. And so they compiled this huge file. Couldn't get anything on him really, but he was still forced to leave. So he was a double exile. He had to go back to Berlin finally. But so Chaplin, you know, is sympathetic. So he was halfway through writing the septet for the circus when he had to leave. So it was quite a tragic tale. So you'll see some screen prints in the ball. I took these FBI files on Eisler that are now declassified, and they've been redacted, so that a lot of the information is actually taken away. And I've had both the sheet music and the FBI files superimposed on top of one another, so you can see Eisler's own handwritten sheet music that I was able to access from the Eisler archive, and have them make these very large screen prints. And I have them chronologically, so the beginning of from when he first arrived to when he was forced to leave. And like I say, a lot of the text has been scored out, and so is some of the Eisler's own hand, where he's scored things out. So there's a kind of correlation between what you hear, because not all the voices are there, so there are these gaps, and what you see on the walls.
But here we hear it all together, obviously. I mean, we don't hear the spatialization of it.
Well,
I mean, in today, off of a film.
Yeah, although you do get a sense of the sound.
Separated?
Like, listen, if you listen. Because he's recorded right up close to the speaker.
Mm. Did you work with Udoki Tellman, or was it Udoki Tellman or another curator you worked with?
It was Gabriel Knapstein. She's really nice. And Ingrid Bushman. So I hope that can give you a better sense of what the technique was, how I did record the work, tone for tone, you know, by seeing that. Sometimes I find that really quite hard to explain.
Very good.
Yeah. So okay, well I'll stop there, because you know we should leave time for questions, shouldn't we?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
So I think we've got 5 minutes for questions, not long, so I'm literally going to stand here and try Yes, please.
Why did you choose was it violin and cello? Why did you choose those two instruments?
Well, for study for strings, I wanted to suggest male and female voice, and I didn't want to work with and they weren't the main melody. I wanted to work with the second parts so that it sounded, yeah, more abstract, you know. Yeah.
Can I just say, we saw the Boy in the Hamburger Hop a few weeks ago, you know, and it was brilliant.
Oh, thanks very much. That's really nice. Oh, thanks. Oh.
I think that the lack of questions are more that we've got this sense of so much information to digest. I'd like to thank everyone for being here. I'd like to thank you both for being here. As we leave, it's warm outside. Don't rush. If you have any questions, these two I'm sure can be persuaded to walk very slowly and sit in the sun. And as you leave, when you leave these art gallery, if you head to your left, you'll see a tree, and beside it is a lump of basalt, and it is one of Boyce's 7,000 poems. So it's there, very quiet and discreet, and I think it's a really good point to
nice. When was that done, or brought
That
here?
was done during Art Strategy. So thank you. And thank you for...
Thank you. Wonderful.